I warned the HOA 3 times to stop cutting across my lawn. They ignored every email and fined me instead. Then Karen looked me straight in the face and said, "Your lawn isn't private unless we say it is." That's when I stopped arguing and started reading their rulebook. Because buried inside their own HOA rules was a loophole so perfect. They never saw it coming. 2 weeks later, her luxury SUV was damaged, the entire board was panicking, and suddenly the rules didn't sound so fair anymore. Stay till the end. Because I didn't break a single rule. I just let the HOA destroy itself. I didn't buy this house because it was fancy. I bought it because it was quiet. Corner lot. Wide lawn. No sidewalk cutting through it. Just grass, trees, and space to breathe. After years of apartment living, that space felt like freedom. The first few months were perfect. Neighbors waved. Kids rode bikes on the street. Dogs stayed on leashes. Everyone respected boundaries without having to talk about them. At least, that's what I thought. The first time someone cut across my lawn, I didn't say anything. It was a jogger. Early morning. Headphones in. He shaved a few steps by cutting diagonally from the sidewalk to the road. I told myself it wasn't worth caring about. Grass grows back. Life goes on. The second time was a dog walker. Then another. Then a delivery driver. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be that neighbor. But after a few weeks, I started noticing the change. The grass near the corner thinned out. A faint dirt line formed where feet kept landing. It wasn't dramatic. Just enough that I noticed it every time I pulled into my driveway. I stood at my window one evening and watched a couple walk straight across my lawn while laughing about something on their phones. They didn't even look at the house. That's when I realized something important. They didn't think this lawn belonged to anyone. I checked my property documents again just to be sure. Survey lines were clear. The corner was fully mine. No easement. No shared access. No public path. Just grass. So I sent a polite email to the HOA. Nothing emotional. Nothing accusatory. I wrote, "Hi, I've noticed increased foot traffic across my lawn. I'd appreciate it if the HOA could remind residents to stay on sidewalks. Thank you." That was it. 2 sentences. I expected either no response, or a simple "we'll remind everyone." Instead, I got a violation notice. It was taped to my front door. Violation, lawn wear and maintenance issue. I read it 3 times. They were fining me for uneven grass. I laughed at first. I honestly thought it was a mistake. I emailed back immediately and attached photos of people walking across the lawn. The reply came the next day. Per HOA guidelines, homeowners are responsible for maintaining lawn appearance regardless of cause. That line stuck with me. Regardless of cause. I asked for clarification. That's when Karen entered the story. Karen was the HOA vice president. Mid-40s. Always overdressed for casual settings. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. She called me instead of replying by email. Her voice was calm. Almost cheerful. "Hi, this is Karen from the HOA. I just wanted to clear things up." I explained the situation again. She listened. Then she said, "Well, your lawn is on a corner." I waited. "That means people are going to walk there," she continued. I told her it was still private property. She paused. Then said, "There's no fence." I said fences weren't required. She laughed softly. Not loudly. Just enough to feel dismissive. Our rules allow common use of open areas when there's no physical barrier. I asked her where that was written. She said, "It's understood." That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest. Because understood wasn't in the rulebook. I went to the next HOA meeting. I brought printed photos, property survey copies of emails. The meeting was held in the clubhouse. Plastic chairs. Folding table. Cheap coffee. Karen sat at the front with 2 other board members. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice steady. I explained everything. The thinning grass. The foot traffic. The fine. I asked one simple question. Can the HOA please tell residents to stay off my lawn? Karen leaned forward. She smiled again. Our rules are about harmony, she said. We don't want to police how neighbors move around. I replied, but you're policing my grass. That smile faded for half a second. Then she said something I will never forget. Your lawn isn't as private as you think. The room was quiet. A few people avoided eye contact. I felt embarrassed. Not angry yet. Just small. I asked if the fine would be removed. Karen shook her head. Maintenance is your responsibility. After that meeting, the foot traffic increased. I don't know if people felt emboldened, or if they just didn't care. But it got worse. Teenagers cut across in groups. Dog walkers let leashes drag. One man started jogging that route daily. I installed a small sign. Private property. Please stay off grass. It disappeared in 2 days. I emailed the HOA again. No response. Then came the second fine. Same reason. Uneven lawn wear. That's when frustration turned into something else. Not rage. Focus. I stopped reacting emotionally. Instead, I started reading. Every HOA rule. Every bylaw. Every amendment. I read them like a contract. Slowly. Carefully. And that's when I noticed something. The HOA was very specific about what homeowners couldn't do, but surprisingly vague about what they could do. There were pages about paint colors, mailbox height, holiday decorations, but landscaping, temporary lawn features. That section was thin, very thin, and buried inside it was a sentence that would eventually change everything. But at the time, I didn't know how. All I knew was this: if the HOA wanted to play by the rules, I would too. Exactly. That night, I stood on my porch and watched someone cut across my lawn again. I didn't yell. I didn't wave. I just watched. And for the first time since buying the house, I didn't feel powerless. I felt patient. Because when people start treating your property like it belongs to everyone, the smartest move isn't to fight them. It's to let the rules do the fighting for you. After the second fine, I stopped opening my front door as much. Not because I was scared. Because every time I stepped outside, I noticed something new. A deeper dirt path. Flattened grass near the corner. Footprints that didn't even try to hide what they were doing. People weren't just cutting across my lawn anymore. They were comfortable doing it. That's the dangerous part of entitlement. It grows quietly. And once it settles in, it feels permanent. I paid the fine. Not because I agreed with it, but because I wanted a clean record. I didn't want the HOA to paint me as non-compliant before I was ready. Instead, I documented everything. Every morning, before work, I took photos from the same angle. Same time. Same lighting. I didn't post them. I didn't share them. I saved them. Because one thing I'd learned from watching HOA disputes unfold online was this: facts matter less than records. The third fine came a month later. This time, it was higher. Repeated maintenance issues, they called it. That was when I stopped being polite. I emailed the HOA board directly and requested a formal review. Karen replied within the hour. She wrote, "Your lawn condition continues to violate HOA standards. The board has already addressed your concerns." Addressed. That word again. I replied calmly and asked for written clarification on whether my lawn was considered private property. The response didn't come from Karen. It came from the HOA's management company. One paragraph. Very careful wording. While homeowners retain ownership, certain areas may be subject to community use expectations. Community use expectations. No legal citation. No rule number. Just language designed to sound official without meaning anything. That's when I realized something important. They weren't confident. If they were sure, they'd point to a rule. Instead, they hid behind vague phrases. At the next HOA meeting, I wasn't emotional. I wasn't defensive. I was precise. I asked one question. Can you show me the rule that allows residents to walk across my property? Karen shifted in her seat. She said, "We don't have time to debate hypotheticals." I replied, "It's not hypothetical. It's happening every day." Another board member cleared his throat. Karen raised her hand to stop him. She said, "The board's position hasn't changed." That was it. Meeting over. People stood up. Chairs scraped. And as I gathered my papers, Karen leaned toward me and whispered something that felt like a threat disguised as advice. "You don't want to be difficult. These things tend to escalate." I smiled and said, "I agree." That night, I went back to the rulebook. Not skimming this time. Studying. I printed it out and highlighted sections. Yellow for landscaping. Blue for temporary structures. Pink for enforcement procedures. That's when I noticed how uneven the document really was. They were strict about appearances. Loose about function. And there it was. One sentence under temporary lawn features. Homeowners may install non-permanent landscaping or functional features, provided they do not pose a hazard or become permanent structures. That sentence kept me awake. Non-permanent. Functional. Not a hazard. Those words mattered. Because the HOA loved definitions when it suited them. So I looked up theirs. They defined hazard as anything intended to cause harm. Intent. Not effect. That distinction would matter later. Before I did anything, I decided to test them. I installed small decorative stones along the corner of the lawn. Nothing sharp. Nothing tall. Just enough to break the straight walking line. Within 2 days, I got an email. "Please remove unauthorized landscaping." I replied with the rule citation. Karen responded with silence. The stones stayed. People walked around them. Some still cut across, but fewer. That was the first crack. Then the complaints started. Not to me. About me. Neighbors whispered. I overheard one woman say, "He's making it hard to walk." Another said, "Why doesn't he just put up a fence?" That question bothered me. Because fences were expensive. And unnecessary. And more importantly, the HOA didn't want fences. They'd rejected multiple fence requests over the years for aesthetic reasons. That irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, a man knocked on my door. Middle-aged. Friendly face. He introduced himself and said, "Hey, people are saying you're trying to block access." I replied calmly, "I'm protecting my lawn." He shrugged. "Feels aggressive," he said. Aggressive. That word followed me around for weeks. Not because I was doing anything aggressive, but because I was refusing to surrender. And people don't like resistance when they're used to convenience. Then came the warning letter. Not a fine. A warning. It said my modifications were being reviewed. Karen had signed it. That was the moment I realized something else. She was paying attention now. Which meant I was on the right track. I didn't rush. That was the hardest part. Every instinct said, "Do something." But rushing makes mistakes. Instead, I planned. I measured the lawn. Mapped foot traffic paths. Noted times of day. Morning joggers. Afternoon dog walkers. Evening couples. Patterns emerged. And patterns are predictable. That's when the idea shifted from defense to design. I didn't want to block the lawn completely. That would invite enforcement. Instead, I wanted to change behavior. Make crossing inconvenient. Uncomfortable. But not dangerous. And definitely not illegal. I consulted a landscaper. I didn't tell him the whole story. Just said I wanted decorative deterrence. He smiled knowingly. He'd seen this before. 2 weeks later, Karen emailed again. She asked for a meeting. Not a board meeting. Just the two of us. That's when I knew things were about to change. Because when someone who's been dismissing you suddenly wants a private conversation, it's not because they feel confident. It's because they feel exposed. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. At the clubhouse. Same plastic chairs. Same folding table. But this time, no audience. As I walked in, Karen was already there. She didn't smile. She said, We need to talk about your lawn. I sat down and replied, yes, we do. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't defending myself. I was waiting. Karen didn't bother with small talk. No smile. No polite tone. She opened a folder and slid a stack of papers across the table toward me. These are complaints, she said. I looked down. Printed emails. Handwritten notes. Anonymous comments. All saying the same thing in different ways. His blocking access. His changing the neighborhood. His making it harder to walk. I flipped through them slowly. None of them mentioned my name. None of them mentioned property lines. They just talked about inconvenience. I set the papers down and said, are any of these about rule violations? Karen leaned back. They're about community impact, she said. I asked, which rule did I break? She didn't answer. Instead, she said, you're creating tension. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't about grass. It was about control. Karen tapped the folder. You've been here less than a year, she said. People expect things to stay the same. I replied, I expect my property to stay mine. She sighed, like I was being unreasonable. The HOA exists to maintain harmony. I smiled slightly. And I'm following the rules. Her jaw tightened. She changed tactics. You could solve this easily, she said. Remove the landscaping. Let people pass. We'll drop the fines. That sentence told me everything. They weren't enforcing rules. They were negotiating compliance. I said, so the fines are leverage. Karen looked at me sharply. No, she said. They're consequences. I nodded. Then show me the violation. Silence. The meeting ended without resolution. But as I stood to leave, Karen said something that crossed a line. If this continues, the board may take further action. I turned and asked, what kind of action? She smiled again. The same smile as before. The kind that gets expensive. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared. Because I was alert. When someone threatens you without specifics, it means they're bluffing, or they're planning something. I decided to assume both. The next week, HOA activity around my house increased. I saw board members walk by more often. Stop. Look. Write notes. One afternoon, a man in a polo shirt took photos of my lawn. I asked who he was. He said, HOA compliance. I asked what violation he was documenting. He said, just routine. Routine. That word again. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a notice of review. They claimed my lawn modifications might be unsafe. Unsafe. I read that word over and over. Because if they could label something unsafe, they could force removal. I contacted a lawyer. Not to start a lawsuit. Just to understand my position. He read the HOA rules and laughed quietly. This is vague, he said. They don't like that you're pushing back. He advised me to document everything and make no changes without written approval. I thanked him. Then I did something smarter. I asked him one more question. If they escalate, what's my best defense? He answered without hesitation. Their own rules. I requested written clarification from the HOA. Again. This time, I copied the management company. I asked 3 questions. What specific rule am I violating? What makes my lawn features unsafe? What enforcement process will be followed? The response came 2 days later. It answered none of them. Instead, it warned me about continued non-cooperation. Non-cooperation. For following the rules. Meanwhile, neighbors started avoiding me. Not all of them. But enough that I noticed. Friendly waves stopped. Conversations cut short. One woman crossed the street to avoid walking past my house. I didn't blame them. HOAs create narratives. And once someone is labeled difficult, facts stop mattering. Then came the escalation. I came home from work one evening and found a temporary orange notice staked into my lawn. HOA safety review in progress, no explanation. Just that. I stood there staring at it. Anger finally surfaced. Not explosive. Cold. They were marking my property like it wasn't mine. I took photos. Then I removed the sign. The next morning, Karen called. Her voice was sharp. You removed an official notice. I replied calmly, you placed it on my private property without permission. She said, it was for safety. I asked, what hazard? She paused. Then said, the board is concerned. Concern again. No rule. No evidence. Just authority flexing. That was when I realized the HOA wasn't planning to back down. They were going to push until I folded. So I changed my goal. I stopped trying to make them stop. Instead, I decided to make them commit. Commit to a position. Commit to a claim. Because once they put something in writing, they'd be accountable for it. I sent one final email. Short. Professional. I wrote, please confirm in writing whether the HOA considers my lawn a common use area. That was it. No emotion. No accusation. Just a question. Karen replied the next morning. And that reply would eventually undo everything. She wrote, your lawn is not designated as common property, but residents may reasonably traverse open areas. I read it twice. Then a third time. Because that sentence contradicted itself. Not designated as common property, but may be used as if it were. That was the crack. I forwarded that email to my lawyer. He replied with one sentence. They just admitted it's private. That was the moment the plan became clear. Not vague. Not defensive. Clear. If my lawn was private, then trespass was real. And if trespass was real, then their enforcement was backwards. They weren't protecting the community. They were enabling violations. I didn't respond to Karen. Instead, I made copies. Printed them. Saved them. Then I scheduled a landscaping consultation. Not for beauty. For function. For compliance. For change. A week later, I received another HOA notice. This one demanded removal of potentially hazardous features. No deadline. No citation. Just pressure. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because pressure without precision is weakness. And the HOA was about to learn what happens when rules are used the wrong way. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching yet another person hesitate before cutting across my lawn, I knew the next phase was coming. The phase where Karen would try to reassert control. The phase where the HOA would overstep. And the phase where their own rules would finally stop protecting them. The landscaper arrived on a Monday morning. Early. Before most people left for work. That wasn't an accident. I wanted witnesses. Not an audience. Just enough eyes to make things normal. He walked the lawn slowly. Measured. Asked questions. I showed him the HOA rulebook. He read the relevant section twice. Then he nodded. This is allowed, he said. As long as it's not permanent. I asked him to explain what that meant. He said, no concrete. No deep anchors. Everything removable. Perfect. The design wasn't aggressive. No spikes. No traps. Just raised soil contours. Decorative stone edging. And low-profile garden fixtures that subtly redirected foot traffic. Think of it like water flowing around rocks. People don't fight obstacles. They go around them. That was the goal. Installation took 2 days. The first day, neighbors watched from windows. No one complained openly. The second day, Karen drove by twice. Slowly. She didn't stop. But she didn't wave either. By the end of the week, the dirt path was gone. Not erased. Abandoned. People hesitated. Adjusted. Took the sidewalk. It worked. And it was quiet. That's what bothered the HOA the most. The notice came 3 days later. This one had a deadline. Remove unapproved structures within 72 hours. I read it carefully. Still no rule citation. Still no explanation. Just authority. I didn't respond. I waited. Because I wanted to see how far they'd go without justification. On the second day, Karen showed up in person. She didn't knock. She stood at the edge of my lawn and called my name. I stepped outside. She gestured at the landscaping. "This needs to come out," she said. I asked, "Under what rule?" She said, "It's unsafe." I asked, "How?" She crossed her arms. "It forces people into the street." That was the line. I pointed to the sidewalk. "People belong there." She frowned. "That's not how this community works." I replied, "Then update the rules." Karen pulled out her phone. She took photos. Then she said something that would matter later. "If someone gets hurt, this will be on you." I said, "Then I'll need that in writing." She didn't respond. She left. That night, I received an email. Subject: Final warning. It accused me of ignoring HOA authority. It threatened fines. Large ones. I forwarded it to my lawyer. He replied with 2 words. "Let them." The 72-hour deadline passed. Nothing happened. No fines. No removal. Just silence. Until Saturday morning. I woke up to the sound of metal. Not loud. Rhythmic. I looked out the window. 2 men in HOA polos were standing on my lawn. One held a clipboard. The other had tools. My stomach dropped. I went outside immediately. "What are you doing?" I asked. The man with the clipboard said, "We're here to remove unsafe features." I asked, "With what authority?" He pointed to the clipboard. "Board approval." I asked to see it. He hesitated. Then showed me a generic work order. No signature. No citation. Just instructions. I told them to stop. They didn't. They started pulling stones. That's when I called the police. Not angrily. Calmly. I said, "The HOA is trespassing and damaging my property." The dispatcher asked if I felt threatened. I said no. I just wanted it documented. The men stopped when they saw me on the phone. They stepped back. Karen arrived 5 minutes later. She looked furious. "What are you doing?" she demanded. I said, "Protecting my property." She said, "This is HOA land." I said, "You put in writing that it isn't." Her face changed. Just for a second. The police arrived. 1 officer. He listened to both sides. I showed him. Property survey HOA email photos of installation. Karen argued about safety. The officer asked, "Is this common property?" Karen said, "No." That was it. He told the HOA workers to leave. He told Karen not to return without legal documentation. He wrote a report. Neighbors gathered. Phones came out. Karen walked back to her car without saying a word. That moment shifted everything. Not loudly, but visibly. The HOA had crossed the line. And they'd been stopped. That afternoon, emails started flying. HOA emergency meeting scheduled. Karen wanted enforcement. Others wanted damage control. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Because now there was a police report. And that changed the power dynamic. The following Monday, I received an apology. Not from Karen. From the HOA management company. They said there had been a miscommunication. They asked for a pause on enforcement. I agreed. In writing. But something else happened that week. Something no one expected. Karen's behavior changed. She stopped making eye contact. She avoided my street. Because now she wasn't dealing with a difficult homeowner. She was dealing with evidence. And evidence doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to consequences. The apology email felt strange. Not because it existed. But because of what it avoided. No mention of trespassing. No mention of the police. No mention of Karen's claim that my lawn was HOA land. Just one sentence repeated in different ways. There was a miscommunication. I read it slowly. Miscommunication doesn't involve tools. Miscommunication doesn't involve entering private property. Miscommunication doesn't require law enforcement. But I replied politely. I accepted the pause. Not because I trusted them. Because I wanted them calm. People make worse mistakes when they think the danger has passed. For about a week, everything was quiet. Too quiet. No notices. No fines. No drive-bys. Neighbors resumed normal behavior. Some waved again. A few even smiled. I could feel the tension easing. But Karen didn't disappear. She just changed tactics. The next HOA meeting notice included a new agenda item. Community pathway review. That phrase caught my attention. I attended. So did more people than usual. Karen sat at the front again. But she didn't lead. The HOA president did. Karen stayed quiet. That was new. The president opened by talking about walkability. About community flow. Then Karen stood up. She introduced a proposal. A temporary walking path across certain corner properties. Including mine. She said it wouldn't be permanent. Just marked. She said it would solve tension. I raised my hand. I asked one question. Would this require homeowner consent? Karen hesitated. Then said, the board can approve temporary measures. I asked, under what rule? The room went silent. Someone in the back spoke up. Didn't the police say that land was private? Karen's face tightened. She said, that was about a misunderstanding. There it was again. Misunderstanding. I stood up. I spoke calmly. I said, if the HOA wants a path, it can build a sidewalk on HOA land. Murmurs. I added, my property is not HOA land. More murmurs. Karen interrupted. She said, you're being unreasonable. That word again. Unreasonable. I replied, I'm being consistent. The proposal didn't pass. Too many questions. Too much discomfort. Karen sat down. Her hands were shaking. Just slightly. After the meeting, she approached me. Her tone was low. Urgent. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, she said. I replied, you made it bigger when you brought tools. She said, we're trying to fix this. I said, by taking more. She didn't answer. 2 days later, a new notice appeared on my door. This one wasn't about safety. It was about aesthetics. Landscaping out of character with community standards. I laughed out loud. Out of character. Because now they were reaching. I didn't respond. Instead, I sent the notice to my lawyer. He replied, they're flailing. That night, something happened that shifted the story from HOA dispute to neighborhood drama. Karen's SUV was parked across the street from my house. Engine running. She was on her phone. I noticed because she wasn't there to visit anyone. She was watching. I stepped onto my porch. She didn't wave. She drove off. The next afternoon, she returned. This time, she got out of the car. She walked across the street. Straight toward my lawn. She stepped onto it. Deliberately. Right over the stone edging. I froze. She looked at me and said, see? Nothing happens. Then she turned to walk back. Her heel caught. She didn't fall. But she stumbled. And in that moment of panic, her SUV rolled forward. She'd forgotten to fully engage the brake. The sound was sharp. Metal on reinforced fixture. Crunch. Neighbors came out. Phones came up. Karen screamed. Not in pain. In anger. She accused me of sabotage. Of creating a trap. I didn't say anything. I handed her the paperwork. The same documents I'd shown the police. The police came again. Same officer. He listened. He looked at the fixture. He looked at the rules. He asked one question. Did you enter his property? Karen said, yes, but that was enough. No charges. No citation. Just a report. But this time, it spread. People talked. Not about grass. About Karen. About power. About ego. The HOA emergency meeting that followed was chaotic. Karen demanded enforcement. Others demanded her resignation. She shouted. She blamed me. She blamed the rules. She blamed the community. But not herself. 2 weeks later, Karen resigned. Quietly. No announcement. Just gone. The HOA installed sidewalks that year. Real ones. On HO land. No more shortcuts. No more fines. And my lawn. It grew back. Better than before. Because respect returned with it. The day Karen resigned, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder. Not quieter. Just shifted. It was subtle at first. Neighbors no longer avoided me. They waved. They smiled. Some even came by to chat about the incident. Not gossiping maliciously, curious, but respectful. I stood on my porch that evening, surveying the lawn. Grass growing evenly. Stone edging still in place. The sun reflecting off carefully placed fixtures. Everything exactly as it should be. No fines. No threats. No overreach. Just peace. The HOA scrambled to repair its image. Emails were sent to residents. Community harmony is a priority. Temporary disruptions were regrettable. New sidewalks will improve safety. Karen's name was never mentioned. But everyone knew. I started receiving messages from neighbors I had never interacted with. Some apologized for believing HOA claims without checking facts. Some laughed at the spectacle, shaking their heads at the irony. A few admitted quietly that Karen had overstepped. Everyone had witnessed it, directly or indirectly. I didn't respond to most. Some I did. Polite. Calm. Never boastful. Because that wasn't the point. Karen disappeared from neighborhood events. No more HOA meetings. No more calls. No more friendly drive-bys. I heard rumors that she took a position in another town. A smaller community. Fewer people. Less chance to wield power. I smiled quietly. Justice often works silently. And that's how it's most effective. The lawns around my house recovered. Grass returned to its healthy green. The raised soil mounds added subtle charm. Neighbors slowly adapted to the new flow of foot traffic. The pathways naturally diverted people without confrontation. Even the dog walkers adjusted their routes. No one needed reminders. I reflected on what had happened. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about power. This was about boundaries, respect, and the ability to enforce rules, fairly and legally. Karen tried to assert dominance. The HOA tried to enforce authority without accountability. And I simply used the rules to protect what was mine. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dangerous. Just methodical, patient, and legal. I also learned a lesson about patience. Most people react immediately. Emotionally. Fist first, thought second. That rarely works against organized institutions. Especially when they misuse their authority. Patience allows observation, documentation, planning, and when the moment is right, leverage. Some neighbors started asking me questions about the process. Did you ever feel scared? Were you worried about fines? How did you stay calm? I told them the truth. Yes, I was concerned. But I trusted the documentation. I trusted the law. And I trusted that people who act without justification eventually expose themselves. They nodded slowly. Not all lessons are about confrontation. Some are about clarity. Meanwhile, HOA meetings continued. Karen's absence changed dynamics. The remaining board members were cautious. Fines and threats became rare. When disputes arose, documentation became key. Residents started referencing rules and agreements, not just feelings. And for the first time in years, the HOA felt accountable. I received an email from a resident months later. Thanks for standing your ground. We all learned something from the HOA incident. I replied simply, rules exist to protect everyone, not just some. And that summed it up. The lawn became more than just grass. It became a symbol. A reminder that systems, even flawed ones, can be respected. A reminder that patience and strategy often succeed where anger fails. A reminder that boundaries matter. And most importantly, it became a place of peace again. Karen's SUV was never seen crossing my lawn again. Nor any other board members. The police report still existed. Just in case. Not as a weapon, but as proof that authority is accountable. I often walk past the raised soil mounds, the decorative stones, the subtle garden fixtures. Neighbors smile as they adjust their path. No one complains. No one trips. No one fights. And it works beautifully. Looking back, I realized the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't fines or threats. It wasn't the letters. It wasn't even Karen. It was underestimating me. Underestimating my willingness to follow rules and insist on fairness. To be patient. To be methodical. To let the system expose its flaws naturally. In the end, no one was publicly humiliated. No one was physically harmed. No law was broken. And yet, the lesson was clear. Abuse of authority has consequences. Disrespecting property and rules backfires. And sometimes, quiet patience delivers justice more effectively than confrontation ever could. I still mow the lawn myself. Carefully. Meticulously. Because it's mine. And now, everyone knows it. Neighbors sometimes pass by and ask about the lawn. I smile. I warned them, I say quietly. And it's true. The rules backfired. Just as they should have. Weeks passed after Karen resigned. The neighborhood felt calmer. HOA meetings were shorter. More structured. Rules were referenced with citations, not opinions. I noticed subtle shifts everywhere. Neighbors now discussed disputes calmly. Emails were polite, backed with evidence. People who used to gossip now cited rules before speaking. It was like the entire community had learned something without being told directly. I also noticed a change in Karen's former influence. Her absence left a vacuum. No one tried to enforce arbitrary rules like she had. Instead, the HOA became cautious. Letters sent to residents included references to rules and procedures. They avoided vague threats. They avoided personal attacks. That was a big win, silently achieved. I reflected on my own approach throughout this ordeal. The first instinct for most people would have been anger. Yelling at the board. Posting about it on social media. Filing lawsuits immediately. None of that was necessary. By staying calm, documenting everything, and understanding the rulebook inside and out, I turned a hostile situation into one where the HOA exposed itself. It was patience, not confrontation, that worked. Neighbors came to me quietly, asking questions. How did you stay calm? Were you worried about fines? Did you really think the rules would protect you? I explained. Rules exist for a reason, I said. But people try to twist them for power. If you understand them fully and act logically, the rules protect you more than anger ever could. Some nodded slowly, others looked skeptical, but I knew the point had been made. The lawn itself became a symbol. Raised soil mounds. Decorative stones. Subtle garden fixtures. It wasn't about making life difficult for others. It wasn't aggressive. It was functional. It guided people along appropriate paths. It respected boundaries without confrontation. It respected the law. And most importantly, it worked. Even months later, I could see small acts of passive acknowledgement from neighbors. Dog walkers adjusting their route. Joggers hesitating and using the sidewalk. Children stepping over stones carefully. No one complained anymore. People began to respect private property, sometimes without even being told. I also learned how power dynamics shift slowly. Karen had tried to assert control through her position and personality. She had assumed she could intimidate others because she understood the HOA rules better than most residents. She assumed compliance meant consent. She was wrong. Authority without justification collapses quickly when someone calmly exposes its limits. There were small, funny moments too. One neighbor commented, "I didn't think anyone could win against the HOA." I smiled and said nothing. The lesson was visible, not verbal. Another joked about installing their own defensive landscaping. I laughed. But I didn't offer advice. Patience and timing mattered. The HOA had already learned the consequences. The HOA board learned another important lesson too. Not all residents will fold under pressure. Not all complaints should be acted upon without verification. And enforcing rules incorrectly or without authority can backfire badly. I began to notice more structured HOA procedures. Review committees for complaints, proper documentation required before fines, clear communication channels. Everything became more transparent. I also realized the emotional toll of the conflict. It wasn't anger that stayed with me. It was tension. That lingering feeling of being watched, being judged. Once the HOA's authority was challenged and their limits enforced, that tension faded. Peace wasn't just physical, it was psychological. And yet, there were small lingering effects. Karen herself became a cautionary tale. Whenever the topic came up, neighbors would shake their heads and mention her overreach. She had tried to play power games with rules she didn't fully understand. She had forgotten that property ownership, documentation, and law trump personal opinion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I reflected further on the neighborhood itself. This incident became a quiet turning point. Residents were more observant, more careful, more respectful of boundaries. HOA discussions were more structured. Less about favoritism or authority flexing. More about actual governance and fairness. All because one homeowner insisted on following the rules correctly. I also reflected on the idea of revenge, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. It wasn't personal attack. It wasn't chaos. It was simply letting the system work. Karen's arrogance, the board's overreach, and the attempts to intimidate were their own undoing. The rules I followed were their own undoing. No drama needed. No illegal action. Just patience, logic, and documentation. Months later, I would tell new neighbors the story. Not to boast. Not to frighten. But as a lesson, know your rights. Follow the rules. And never underestimate what patience can achieve. It became a sort of legend quietly whispered among residents. The HOA still existed, of course. But its influence had changed. People were cautious, respectful, and procedural. And for me, that was the ultimate win. Even today, when I mow the lawn or check the landscaping, I feel satisfaction. Not from the confrontation. Not from proving Karen wrong. But from knowing that boundaries were respected. Rules were enforced fairly. Justice had been delivered quietly, methodically. The weeks after Karen's departure weren't just about peace. They were about observation. A chance to see how the neighborhood adjusted when authority faltered and rules were enforced correctly. I noticed small changes almost immediately. Neighbors started walking along proper paths instead of cutting across lawns. Dog walkers respected boundaries. Even children hesitated before crossing the corner of my property. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. The neighborhood had learned boundaries the quiet way. People also began to reflect on the HOA's previous behavior. Rumors about Karen circulated. Some said she left the town altogether. Others claimed she moved to a smaller community, hoping to regain control in a less challenging environment. Regardless, she had been exposed, not publicly, but in a way that mattered. Her tactics no longer worked here. That was the subtle form of karma at play. I also saw the HOA board evolve. New procedures were implemented. All complaints required evidence. All enforcement had to cite exact rules. Fines were no longer arbitrary. The fear-driven culture that Karen had fostered was gone. It had been replaced by caution and accountability. I witnessed this firsthand in the following months. A new resident submitted a complaint about a mailbox. The board required proof and followed process step by step. No intimidation. No overreach. The HOA had learned the hard way. Power without rules is dangerous. Interestingly, neighbors who had previously avoided me now approached casually. "Glad you stuck to it," one said. Another laughed. "I didn't think anyone could stand up to Karen." I responded simply, "Rules protect everyone if used correctly." I didn't have to explain more. The message was clear. And it stuck. One day, a teenager approached me while playing with his dog. "You really made her SUV get messed up, didn't you?" he asked, grinning. I smiled and shook my head. Not me. The rules did that. He laughed. And for him, it was a lesson in cause and effect. Actions have consequences, even for people in power. Another interesting dynamic emerged with neighbors who had previously sided with Karen. Some were embarrassed. Some quietly apologized for assuming her version of events. Others avoided confrontation entirely. The power shift was subtle but permanent. Karen's overreach had unintentionally created a sense of shared vigilance among residents. People now watched and respected the rules, not just for themselves, but to prevent abuse. I also reflected on my own behavior during this time. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't flaunted authority. I hadn't broken any rules. I simply documented, followed regulations, and acted patiently. That approach protected me legally and morally. It also ensured that the consequences Karen faced weren't exaggerated. No one was harmed physically. No laws were broken. The HOA's missteps were self-inflicted. The landscaping itself became a neighborhood talking point. People admired it quietly. Functional and pretty, one neighbor said. I thought it was aggressive at first, said another, but now it makes sense. It had become an example of how private property could be maintained responsibly. Even the raised soil mounds and stone edging became accepted. Children played around them carefully. Dogs walked along adjusted paths. No conflicts arose. There was also a subtle psychological effect on the remaining HOA board members. They were more cautious in meetings, more methodical in issuing letters, more deliberate in enforcement. Where once vague authority was wielded aggressively, now it was tempered by procedure. That shift alone prevented further conflicts. I noticed another side effect: accountability in small, unexpected ways. Residents now took photos when complaints arose. Neighbors recorded events carefully. Discussions became evidence-based. It wasn't paranoia, it was trust in documentation and the rules. People realized that authority without proof could fail. And they adjusted behavior accordingly. Months later, I reflected on Karen's final moment before leaving. The SUV incident was a turning point. Not dramatic, but symbolic. Her arrogance collided with reality, and the result was exposure. It was a quiet, legal, and effective form of karma. No one cheered. No one laughed openly. But everyone understood the lesson. In the following months, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Children played. Dogs ran along paths. Neighbors waved. But now, everyone had a new awareness. Rules mattered. Boundaries mattered. Authority could be challenged, carefully, patiently, legally, and the consequences would follow. The lawn itself remained a symbol. Every stone, every mound, every fixture stood as a quiet reminder of what patience, planning, and adherence to rules could achieve. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was just effective. I realized the biggest lesson from the entire ordeal wasn't about HOA fines or personal vindication. It was about respect. Respect for property. Respect for rules. Respect for others. Once that respect is absent, chaos can follow. And when authority is abused, consequences are inevitable. Even today, I watch neighbors adjust their paths. I never intervene. I just observe. And every time, I am reminded, I didn't break any rules. I didn't escalate unnecessarily. I just let the system, and those who misused it, reveal their own mistakes. And in that quiet way, justice was served. By the time the neighborhood fully settled, I had spent months reflecting on the entire situation. It started as a small frustration, a few people cutting across my lawn, but it had evolved into a battle of rules, authority, and patience. I realized how easily power could be abused. Karen wasn't malicious in an obvious way. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone physically, but she tried to control people using vague authority. And that's just as dangerous in a community as any outright hostility. What struck me most was the way rules are interpreted. The HOA's rulebook was detailed in some areas and vague in others. Karen exploited those gaps, assuming she could bend them to her will. But the same gaps became my advantage. By following the rules literally, I forced accountability. I hadn't expected it to be so effective. I had expected arguments, fines, perhaps even long legal battles. Instead, patience, documentation, and a clear understanding of the rules turned the situation in my favor. I also realized how critical evidence is. Every photo, every email, every note mattered. Not because I wanted confrontation, but because when authority becomes ambiguous, proof is protection. The police visits, the documented emails, the printed rulebook, all of it created a shield. Without evidence, Karen's threats and attempts at intimidation might have succeeded. One of the biggest lessons was the importance of staying calm under pressure. At first, I felt frustration. Anger bubbled up. Every fine, every email, every comment from Karen made my blood pressure rise. But reacting emotionally would have been a mistake. If I had yelled, threatened, or acted impulsively, the narrative could have shifted against me. The HOA thrives on chaos, it gives them leverage. By staying calm, I removed their power. I also noticed the subtle ripple effect across the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously avoided me started respecting boundaries. Even those who had sided with Karen initially began acknowledging property rights more carefully. The incident became an informal lesson in fairness and accountability. People realized that authority is not always correct. But systems, rules, laws, documentation can protect the individual if used wisely. I reflected on Karen herself. She had left quietly, no drama, no confrontation. Her departure wasn't punishment in the traditional sense. It was natural consequence. Her attempts to control backfired because she relied on intimidation rather than legal grounding. Her arrogance collided with reality. And the result was resignation, exposure, and quiet professional embarrassment. That, I realized, was the purest form of karma. No chaos. No spectacle. Just cause and effect. The lawn itself became a quiet emblem of persistence and careful planning. Every decorative stone, every raised soil mound, every subtle fixture served a purpose. Not to provoke. Not to harm. But to protect boundaries. And it worked. People walked along sidewalks. Dogs didn't trample paths. Even children instinctively navigated the lawn without conflict. It was functional. It was beautiful. And it was a reminder that respect can be enforced without aggression. I also noticed how this experience shaped my approach to community. I became more attentive, more thoughtful. I began engaging neighbors politely when small conflicts arose. I encouraged evidence-based communication rather than speculation. The HOA, as an institution, also improved. New procedures, documentation, and policies emerged directly because of the conflict. They had learned the hard way that unchecked authority leads to mistakes and loss of trust. Another subtle, ongoing lesson was patience. The entire process took months. Frustration, fines, threats, and tense meetings all required careful observation and timing. Had I acted too quickly, I might have escalated unnecessarily or given Karen leverage. The reward of patience wasn't immediate. It wasn't flashy. But when the HOA overstepped, the legal documentation and calm strategy allowed them to overreach and fail without my direct aggression. I also began thinking about human behavior in groups. People follow authority, even when it's wrong, if it appears unified. Karen relied on compliance from others. The board backed her, at least initially. But when challenged carefully, the illusion of authority quickly shattered. The incident became a lesson in social dynamics. Clarity, evidence, and calm reasoning can reveal weaknesses in perceived power structures. In the months after, I occasionally saw Karen's former colleagues at HOA events. They were quieter, more cautious, more deliberate in how they enforced rules. I never confronted them. I didn't need to. The consequences were embedded in their behavior. They had learned accountability. Personally, I continued to enjoy my lawn. Every morning, I mowed, watered, and maintained it carefully. Not out of defiance. Not out of ego. But out of pride for boundaries respected and lessons learned. Neighbors occasionally complimented the landscaping. Some asked for advice on subtle, functional designs. I always emphasized one point: respect rules, respect boundaries, and patience wins more than confrontation. Looking back, the entire experience taught me that power is relative. Authority can intimidate. Rules can be twisted. People can act unfairly. But knowledge, preparation, and calm persistence neutralize all of that. Karen's actions, the HOA's overreach, and the community's initial compliance all created a situation where the system exposed itself. And when the system is exposed fairly, justice, quiet and methodical, emerges naturally. Even today, I walk past my lawn and reflect. It's more than grass and stones. It's a reminder: patience, clarity, and evidence protect you when authority falters. It's a reminder: overconfidence in position without substance leads to consequences. It's a reminder: the quietest victories are often the most lasting. The neighborhood had changed permanently. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a spectacle. It was subtle, but undeniable. Karen was gone. The HOA had learned to enforce rules with accountability. Neighbors now respected boundaries, paths, and each other. And my lawn stood as a quiet testament to the entire journey. The weeks after the conflict ended felt almost surreal. I no longer received threatening emails. No more surprise visits. No more implied fines. No more constant tension. Instead, I experienced calm. A true, sustained calm that comes from knowing you did everything right. I reflected on why it worked. First, rules matter. Not the ones people claim exist, but the ones actually written, legally recognized, and enforceable. Second, documentation matters. Every photo, email, note, or official response became a shield against overreach. Third, patience matters. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't escalate prematurely. I waited for the HOA to overstep, and they did. Fourth, calm clarity matters. When Karen threatened, I stayed composed. When they trespassed, I calmly involved the police. I never lost control of my own narrative. The subtle karma of the situation also unfolded naturally. Karen's attempts to assert power backfired. Her threats were recorded. Her trespass was documented. Her SUV incident became symbolic, even if minor. She didn't face public humiliation, but she faced professional embarrassment. And in a neighborhood where everyone knew the story, her reputation as a control-focused, overreaching figure was quietly cemented. No chaos. No dramatics. Just consequences. The HOA learned long-term lessons as well. New board members referenced clear rules. New processes required evidence for complaints. Fines were precise. Letters included citations. Authority was applied fairly, not arbitrarily. A culture shift occurred, quietly, but permanently. For my neighbors, the incident became a point of reflection. They realized the importance of understanding rules, questioning vague authority, and respecting private property. They saw firsthand how patience and preparation neutralized overreach. They witnessed justice delivered in a methodical, non-aggressive way. Some residents even came to me privately for advice about disputes. I always emphasized: follow the rules, document carefully, stay calm, and let the system reveal mistakes naturally. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries and accountability. Even the landscaping itself remained functional and symbolic. Every decorative stone, every raised mound, every fixture guided behavior without force. Children played carefully around them. Dogs adjusted paths. Neighbors respected the lawn without needing reminders. It had become a quiet monument to planning, patience, and rules followed correctly. I also reflected on the personal growth this experience brought me. I learned to remain composed under pressure, use documentation as a shield and tool, leverage rules fairly but effectively, understand human behavior in groups, recognize that authority without accountability will always falter. These lessons extended far beyond HOA disputes. They applied to workplace conflicts, community issues, and even personal disagreements. Months later, when I walk along my lawn, I smile quietly. Not because I won. Not because I proved anyone wrong. But because boundaries were respected. Justice, subtle as it was, had been restored. And patience had delivered results better than confrontation ever could. I sometimes hear new homeowners ask about the story. They ask why people don't just fight, sue, or yell. I tell them the truth. It's not about fighting. It's about understanding the rules, documenting carefully, and letting the system work. Authority that lacks justification will always falter. Patience and clarity win in the end. They nod. Some smile. Some take notes. And I know the lesson will persist in the community long after Karen and her tactics are gone. Even years later, I notice subtle reminders. HOA letters are polite and precise. Neighbors respect each other's property. Children and dogs follow adjusted paths naturally. No threats, no ambiguity, no overreach. The community trust has been rebuilt. All because someone refused to surrender to vague authority, documented carefully, and applied rules correctly. Looking back, I realize the true victory wasn't for me personally. It was for fairness. For rules applied correctly. For boundaries respected. For the community learning to trust systems, not intimidation. That's the legacy of the lawn. And sometimes, late at night, when the street is quiet, I walk along my property line. I touch the stones, admire the landscaping, and remember the months of patience, strategy, and observation. No one forced me to act recklessly. No one forced drama. Everything was quiet. Everything was fair. And in that quiet fairness, justice had been served. The HOA may never admit it. Neighbors may never fully verbalize it. Karen may never acknowledge it. But the result speaks for itself. Boundaries respected. Rules followed. Authority checked. Peace restored. And my lawn, finally, belongs to me again.